The Gate to the Gulf, an operational and strategic analysis of the Battle of Mobile Bay and the closure of the Confederacy's final logistics hub. 1. Strategic context. The Anaconda tightens by the late summer of 1864. The American Civil War had descended into a grinding, sanguinary stalemate that threatened the political viability of the Lincoln administration. The grand strategic design of the Union, the Anaconda Plan, had largely succeeded in its initial phases, sealing off the Atlantic coast and seizing control of the Mississippi River following the falls of New Orleans and Vicksburg. Yet the Confederacy remained stubbornly resilient. The war had transitioned from a contest of maneuver to a war of logistical attrition, and in this grim calculus, the city of Mobile, Alabama, assumed a disproportionate strategic weight. Following the Union capture of New Orleans in April 1862, Mobile ascended to the status of the premier Confederate port on the Gulf of Mexico. It was not merely a harbor, but a logistical nexus where maritime commerce intersected with the internal rail lines of the Deep South. The Mobile and Ohio Railroad, connecting the port to the strategic interior, allowed for the rapid movement of material and troops to the hard-pressed armies in Tennessee and Georgia. As Atlantic ports like Charleston and Wilmington came under increasing federal pressure, blockade runners shifted their operations to the Gulf. In the years 1863 and 1864, records indicate that at least 37 blockade runners successfully navigated the shoals of Mobile Bay, delivering British Enfields, percussion caps, and medicines essential for the Confederate war effort. The blockade runner SS Siren alone made a record 33 successful runs, underscoring the porosity of the blockade in this sector. The strategic imperative to close Mobile was understood in Washington, but the political imperative was even more acute. The summer of 1864 was a summer of slaughter. General Ulysses S. Grant was bogged down in the trench lines of Petersburg. General William T. Sherman seemed stalled at the gates of Atlanta. War weariness in the North had reached a fever pitch, fueling the Peace Democrats and the presidential campaign of General George B. McClellan. President Abraham Lincoln, viewing the landscape with a melancholic realism, penned his famous blind memorandum on August 23, 1864, conceding that it seems exceedingly probable that this administration will not be reelected. To reverse this trajectory, the Union required not just a victory, but a decisive, incontrovertible triumph that could be plastered across the broadsheets of the North. The seizure of Mobile Bay was identified as the catalyst for this political reversal. Before we turn to the theater of operations, you should operate that like and subscribe button. Comment and tell us what you think of this format. Thank you. 2. The theater of operations, hydrography and fortifications. The geography of Mobile Bay presented a defensive architect's dream and an attacker's nightmare. A bell-shaped estuary stretching 30 miles inland. Its entrance was guarded by two narrow peninsulas, Mobile Point to the east and Dauphin Island to the west. The main shipping channel, the only route capable of accommodating deep draft naval vessels, ran tight against the eastern shore, directly under the guns of Fort Morgan. Fort Morgan, the guardian of the pass constructed in 1834. Fort Morgan was a formidable masonry star fortification, mounting approximately 46 guns. Its armament was a mixture of heavy smoothbores and rifled artillery, including 10-inch Columbiads and 7-inch and 8-inch Brooke rifles, capable of smashing wooden hulls and denting iron armor. The garrison, commanded by Brigadier General Richard L. Page, a former officer in the United States Navy and a cousin of Robert E. Lee, was disciplined and entrenched. Page, known as a strict disciplinarian with a ramrod demeanor, had cleared the fields of fire by burning all wooden structures outside the fort, preparing his command for a fight to the finish. Fort Gaines and Fort Powell across the channel on Dauphin Island stood Fort Gaines, a smaller masonry work mounting 26 guns. While formidable against land assault, its distance from the main channel, nearly 3 miles, meant it could not offer effective mutual support to Morgan against a fleet hugging the eastern shore. To the northwest, guarding Grant's Pass and the approaches from Mississippi Sound, lay Fort Powell. This earthwork fortification was designed to prevent light gunboats from flanking the main defenses, mounting roughly 16 guns. The infernal machines, the torpedo fields. The Confederate defense relied not only on masonry and iron, but on the infernal machines of underwater warfare. Recognizing the disparity in naval strength, the Confederates deployed a dense field of torpedoes, naval mines, to funnel attacking ships into a kill zone. The primary weapon was the Singer torpedo, invented by Edgar C. Singer, nephew of the sewing machine magnate. These devices were terrifyingly simple: a tin or iron case filled with gunpowder, topped with a spring loaded plunger mechanism held in place by a heavy iron cap. Upon contact with a ship's hull, the cap would dislodge, releasing the plunger to strike a percussion cap and detonate the charge. Approximately 180 of these mines were laid in three staggered rows, stretching from Fort Gaines eastward toward the main channel. A single red buoy marked the eastern limit of the minefield, leaving a narrow, unobstructed passage directly under the guns of Fort Morgan. This forced any attacking admiral to choose between the certainty of artillery fire and the probability of underwater destruction. 3. Order of battle and technological asymmetry. The engagement at Mobile Bay represented a collision of naval eras. It pitted the zenith of wooden sailing frigates, adapted for steam, against the emerging dominance of the ironclad Monitor and the casemate ram. The Union West Gulf blockading squadron, Rear Admiral David Glasgow Farragut, assembled a fleet that was a hybrid of the old and new navies. His force consisted of 18 vessels, 4 ironclad monitors, and 14 wooden steamers. The ironclads, Farragut, though an old salt who privately preferred wooden decks, recognized that the presence of the Confederate ram Tennessee necessitated armor. He delayed his attack for weeks, waiting for the arrival of the monitors. USS Tecumseh, a Canonicus-class monitor mounting two 15-inch Dahlgren smoothbores in a single revolving turret. USS Manhattan, a sister ship to the Tecumseh, also carrying the massive 15-inch guns, capable of firing 440-pound solid shot. USS Winnebago, a Milwaukee-class double-turret river monitor, carrying four 11-inch Dahlgrens. USS Chickasaw, a sister ship to the Winnebago. Life aboard these iron pots was hellish. Robert B. Ely, an officer aboard the Manhattan, described the conditions in his journal. The heat was stifling. The mosquitoes were relentless. The monitors were barely seaworthy, requiring towing by wooden vessels to reach the combat zone. They leaked, they sweltered, and in rough seas, they were washed over by waves, forcing crews to live in a sealed, humid twilight. The wooden fleet, Farragut employed a tactical formation he had perfected at Port Hudson, lashing his wooden vessels in pairs. The heavier sloops were lashed to the port side of smaller gunboats. The logic was redundant safety. If the larger vessel's machinery was disabled by fort fire, the gunboat could tow it to safety or keep it in the line. Brooklyn lashed to Octorara, Hartford flagship lashed to Metacomet, Richmond lashed to Port Royal, Lackawanna lashed to Seminole, Monongahela lashed to Kennebec, Ossipee lashed to Itasca, Oneida lashed to Galena. The Brooklyn was placed in the lead because she carried 4 chase guns and a makeshift cowcatcher device intended to sweep for torpedoes, a decision Farragut would rue in the heat of battle. The Confederate squadron opposing this armada was the pitifully small but dangerously concentrated Mobile Squadron under Admiral Franklin Buchanan, CSS Tennessee. The Tennessee was the titan of the Confederate fleet, described by Alfred Thayer Mahan as the most powerful ironclad built from the keel up by the Confederacy. She was 209 feet long, with a casemate protected by 5 to 6 inches of iron plating, bolted over 2 feet of yellow pine and oak backing. She mounted 6 Brooke rifles, 2 7-inch pivots, and 4 4-inch broadsides. However, her construction revealed the resource starvation of the South. Her engines were scavenged from a river steamer, rendering her slow 6 knots max, and her steering chains were exposed in open channels on the aft deck, a fatal design flaw. Supporting the ram were 3 paddle wheel gunboats, the CSS Morgan, CSS Gaines, and CSS Selma. Unarmored but agile, they were tasked with raking the Union fleet from the shallow waters where the deep draft frigates could not follow. 4. Profiles in Command Rear Admiral David G. Farragut. At 63, Farragut was a legend, the first man to hold the rank of Rear Admiral in the U.S. Navy. Yet, physically, he was a wreck. Years of service in the malaria ridden Gulf had left him plagued by vertigo and chronic exhaustion. Despite his infirmities, his command philosophy was defined by aggressive risk taking. He prepared for Mobile Bay with obsessive detail, ordering captains to strip their ships of unnecessary rigging, drape chainmail over the engines, and stack sandbags on deck to protect the crews from splinters. Admiral Franklin Buchanan, Franklin Old Buck Buchanan, was the mirror image of Farragut. They had joined the Navy young, served together in the antebellum years, and now faced each other as premier admirals of opposing nations. Buchanan was the only full admiral in the Confederate Navy, a man of fierce temper and uncompromising discipline. His decision making at Mobile Bay would be characterized by a sink before surrender mentality, reflected in his speech to the crew of the Tennessee: whip and sink the Yankees, or fight until you sink yourselves. 5. Operational logistics, the sinews of war. The campaign was not merely a naval sortie, but a complex joint operation requiring the coordination of the Army and Navy, a rarity in the Civil War. General Ulysses S. Grant had ordered General E.R.S. Canby to support Farragut, but the demands of the Virginia theater siphoned off troops, leaving Major General Gordon Granger with only about 2,000 men to invest the forts. Logistically, the fleet was tethered to coal. The West Gulf blockading squadron relied on one distant bases at Pensacola and Key West, necessitating a constant rotation of ships for refueling. The capture of Mobile Bay would provide a forward anchorage, securing the logistical tail of the blockade. The supply ship Massachusetts and other colliers worked ceaselessly to keep the bunkers full, but the operational tempo was grueling. 6. The Battle of August 5th. The passage of the forts. The morning of August 5th, 1864, broke with a light southwest breeze, pushing the smoke of battle toward the fort, a condition Farragut had waited for. At 5:30 a.m., the fleet got underway. As the vessels formed up, the crews ate a light breakfast, stowing hammocks and sanding the decks to prevent slipping on blood. The sinking of the USS Tecumseh. As the fleet approached the pass at 6:47 a.m., the monitor column led the way. Commander Tam Craven of the Tecumseh, fixated on the looming shape of the Tennessee, made a catastrophic error. Disregarding Farragut's explicit order to stay east of the Red Buoy, Craven steered his monitor directly across the minefield to close with the enemy ram. At approximately 7 a.m., a massive explosion erupted under the Tecumseh. A Singer torpedo detonated against her hull. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Observers on the Hartford and in Fort Morgan watched in horror as the monitor lurched violently, her stern rising high into the air with the propeller still churning, before she plunged bow first beneath the waves. The sinking took less than 30 seconds. Of the 114 men aboard, 93 perished, entombed in their iron coffin. Andrew Johnson, a pilot on the Tecumseh, later recounted the chaos and the heartbreaking final exchange between Craven and his pilot at the foot of the escape ladder. "After you, pilot." The crisis at the Brooklyn. The sudden destruction of the Tecumseh paralyzed the USS Brooklyn. Captain James Alden, seeing the monitor vanish and spotting torpedo buoys ahead, stopped his engines and began to back down. This maneuver threatened to telescope the entire Union column into a tangled mass directly under the guns of Fort Morgan. The Confederates, sensing the confusion, intensified their fire. The Hartford, stuck behind the backing Brooklyn, was raked by shot and shell. Bodies piled up on the deck, blood ran into the scuppers. The operational cohesion of the fleet was on the brink of collapse. Damn the torpedoes. It was in this crucible that Farragut displayed the command presence that defined his career. Perched in the port main rigging to see above the smoke, lashed to the shrouds by Captain Drayton, Farragut witnessed the Brooklyn backing down. "What is the trouble?" he hailed. "Torpedoes," came the cry from the Brooklyn. Damn the torpedoes, Farragut shouted. Four bells, Captain Drayton, go ahead. Duet, full speed. Farragut ordered the Hartford to sheer out of line, pass the Brooklyn to port, and head directly into the minefield. It was a calculated risk of the highest order. As the flagship surged forward, the crew below decks could hear the primers of the torpedoes snapping against the copper bottom of the hull. But they did not explode. The immersion in salt water had corroded the firing mechanisms, or waterlogged the powder. The Hartford cut a path through the infernal machines, and the rest of the fleet followed the flagship into the bay. 7. The gunboat chase. As the Union fleet broke into the bay, they were not safe. Buchanan's three gunboats, Selma, Morgan, and Gaines, retreated into the shallow waters ahead of the fleet, maintaining a raking fire that the Union broadsides could not effectively return. Farragut ordered his gunboats to be cut loose. The signal was given, and the lashings were severed. The USS Metacomet, under Lieutenant Commander James Jouett, was the fastest ship in the fleet. Jouett engaged his engines and pursued the CSS Selma. In a running fight through a squall, the Metacomet overtook the Selma. After a sharp exchange of fire that killed the Selma's executive officer and wounded several others, the Confederate gunboat surrendered. The CSS Gaines, hulled repeatedly and taking on water, was run aground near Fort Morgan by her crew and set ablaze. The CSS Morgan managed to escape, fleeing under the protection of the fort's guns and later making her way to Mobile. 8. The Titan's last stand, Buchanan's sortie. By 8:30 a.m., the Union fleet had anchored 4 miles north of Fort Morgan. The immediate threat seemed over. Stewards began to serve breakfast to the exhausted crews. Surgeons attended to the grisly work of amputation and triage. It was then that lookouts spotted the CSS Tennessee moving. Instead of remaining under the protection of Fort Morgan, Admiral Buchanan was steaming directly toward the Union fleet. He intended to engage 18 warships with a single ironclad. The decision to attack Buchanan's decision has been debated by historians for a century and a half. Was it bravery or folly? Commander J.D. Johnston, the Tennessee's captain, later wrote that he was surprised by the order, but Buchanan was adamant. He hoped to ram the Union ships while they were at anchor, causing chaos before the slow monitors could intervene. It was a suicide run, born of the Confederate naval ethos that a ship should be sacrificed rather than surrendered without a fight. The Malay Farragut, seeing the ram approach, ordered his heavy sloops to run her down. Run down the ram, signaled the admiral. The USS Monongahela struck first, ramming the Tennessee at full speed. The blow shattered the Union ship's iron prow, but barely scratched the Confederate armor. The USS Lackawanna struck next, crashing into the ram's casemate. The impact was so violent it listed the Tennessee, but again the armor held. In the chaos of maneuvering, the Lackawanna collided with the Hartford, cutting the flagship down to the water's edge and nearly sinking Farragut. A moment of friendly fire peril that enraged the admiral. The monitors end the fight while the wooden ships battered themselves against the ironclad. The Union monitors moved into position. The USS Chickasaw, commanded by Lieutenant Commander George Perkins, latched onto the Tennessee's stern like a terrier. Perkins kept his ship positioned directly aft of the ram, pounding the rear of the casemate with his 11-inch guns at a range of 50 yards. This relentless fire severed the exposed steering chains of the Tennessee, leaving her drifting helplessly. Simultaneously, the USS Manhattan maneuvered to the port side and unleashed its 15-inch gun. A 440-pound solid shot struck the casemate. It did not penetrate, but the concussive force shattered the iron plating and drove the wood backing into the interior in a cloud of deadly splinters. The surrender inside the Tennessee. The scene was apocalyptic. The smokestack had been shot away, and the gun deck was filled with smoke and heat, reaching 120 degrees. The gun port shutters were jammed by enemy fire. Admiral Buchanan was supervising the aft gun division when a shell struck the casemate. A splinter fractured his leg, the same leg wounded at Hampton Roads. With the steering gone, the stack down, and the ship unable to bring a gun to bear, Commander Johnston went to the wounded Buchanan. "If you cannot do them any further damage, you had better surrender," Buchanan whispered in pain. Johnston climbed to the roof of the casemate and waved a white flag. It was 10 a.m. The Battle of Mobile Bay was over. 9. The sieges, reducing the forts. The naval victory secured the bay, but the forts remained defiant. What followed was a systematic reduction of the Confederate defenses, showcasing the effectiveness of Union siege operations. The fall of Fort Powell, August 5th. Fort Powell, the earthwork guarding Grant's Pass, was attacked on the afternoon of August 5th by the Monitor Chickasaw. The bombardment was precise and devastating. Lieutenant Colonel Williams, realizing his position was untenable and fearing isolation, evacuated his garrison to the mainland that night. As they retreated, they detonated the magazines, leaving the fort a ruin. The surrender of Fort Gaines, August 8th. Fort Gaines was next. Colonel Charles Anderson found himself besieged by Granger's troops on the landward side and the fleet in the bay. The morale of his garrison, consisting largely of young cadets and reserves, collapsed. Despite furious orders from General Page at Fort Morgan to hold to the last extremity, Anderson concluded that resistance was futile. On August 8th, he surrendered the fort and its 800-man garrison to Farragut and Granger. The siege of Fort Morgan, August 9th, 23. Fort Morgan stood alone. General Granger transferred his forces to the Mobile Point Peninsula, establishing a sophisticated siege line. He deployed powerful artillery batteries, named in honor of Union heroes. Battery Bailey, mounting four 30-pounder Parrott rifles. Battery Farragut, mounting four 10-inch siege mortars. Battery Arnold, mounting four 10-inch siege mortars. General Page, commanding 600 men, refused calls to surrender. "I am prepared to sacrifice life and will only surrender when I have no means of defense," he wrote. On the morning of August 22nd, the final bombardment began. The Union land batteries, combined with the guns of the fleet, including the captured Tennessee, unleashed a storm of iron. Over 3,000 shells struck the fort in 12 hours. A Union soldier described the sky as being filled with 3 to 4 shells in the air all the time. The citadel caught fire, turning the interior into a furnace and threatening the powder magazines. Page ordered the powder dumped into the cisterns to prevent a catastrophic explosion. On the morning of August 23rd, with his walls breached, his guns disabled, and his citadel a smoking ruin, General Page raised the white flag. The surrender ceremony was marred by bitterness. Page was accused of spiking his guns and destroying equipment after the white flag was raised, a violation of the laws of war. Legend holds that he broke his sword over his knee rather than surrender it, though this remains a point of historical contention. 10. Aftermath and strategic legacy. The butcher's bill, the cost of the victory, was substantial. The Union fleet suffered approximately 150 killed, 93 on the Tecumseh alone, and 170 wounded. The Hartford suffered the highest casualties among the wooden ships, with 25 killed and 28 wounded, a testament to the intensity of the fire she drew. Confederate casualties in the naval battle were lighter, 12 killed and 20 wounded on the squadron, but the loss of the forts resulted in the capture of over 1,500 men. Political and strategic impact. The capture of Mobile Bay was a thunderclap in the North. Coming weeks before the fall of Atlanta, it provided the first tangible proof that the Confederacy was collapsing. The Mobile Bitters cartoons mocked the Peace Democrats, and the victory played a pivotal role in securing Lincoln's re-election in November. Strategically, the blockade was now hermetically sealed. Mobile remained in Confederate hands until April 1865, but as a port, it was dead. The flow of supplies to the Army of Tennessee ceased. Doctrine and technology. The battle validated the utility of the Monitor type in coastal warfare and the effectiveness of the naval mine. The sinking of the Tecumseh was a grim foreshadowing of the dominance of mine warfare in the 20th century. Furthermore, the operation stood as a premier example of joint Army-Navy cooperation, a handshake coordination that succeeded where more formal structures had often failed. The Battle of Mobile Bay remains a study in leadership. Farragut's decision to dam the torpedoes was not reckless bravado, but a calculated risk, based on the observation that the Brooklyn's hesitation was more dangerous than the mines. It was the decision of a commander who understood that in war, the most dangerous course is often to stand still.
So